In this video, I want to talk about 5 things Christianity gets from Marcion. Marcion of Sinope. Have you ever heard the name? Marcion of Sinope was famously a guy in the mid-2nd century, so he probably lived from about 80 to about 160. Everything we know about Marcion comes from later writers, some of whom wrote decades and some of whom wrote like a century after Marcion. They told us what they thought happened with Marcion. Now, what did they say Marcion had done? A couple things. First of all, Marcion apparently believed that the God of the Old Testament was an evil, vicious, vindictive tyrant, and that Jesus had actually been sent by a benevolent God to rescue us from that God. As a result of this idea, maybe not surprisingly, Marcion was very against what he saw as like Judaizing tendencies in Christianity. Marcion was apparently circulating some different like biblical texts, which I'll talk about in a minute as part of the video. And again, as a result of his beliefs about the Jewish God, Marcion also didn't believe that there should be an Old Testament or that Christians shouldn't follow the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Marcion of Sinope was a wealthy ship owner from northern Turkey. He probably came to Rome around 140 CE, and he famously donated an enormous amount of money to the Roman Church, something like $2 or $3 million in today's money. This is a lot of money to donate to a church, and apparently at some point they gave it back because of his heresies. Marcion ended up founding his own churches, and apparently they were quite popular, grew quite a lot. This wasn't like a one-off heretic. His influence was quite powerful. Now, if you have been watching any YouTube videos about the Bible at all, you've probably heard the name Marcion because there are some really interesting ideas floating around about Marcion right now, and these include the possibility that Marcion had an earlier version of the Gospel of Luke than our version. These include things like Marcion affecting the formation of the Canon, and not only the formation of the Canon, but actually that the Canon was rewritten after as a response to Marcion. I've also interviewed a biblical scholar who does a lot with Marcion's work named Marcus Vincent, and you can actually watch that video here. So the problem is, I think a lot of people hear about Marcion on YouTube, hear about him in some cutting-edge biblical scholarship, and there's still like some different like conversation over Marcion's exact role in the foundation of Christianity. And there's different sides to the coin and different interpretations of what that role means. However, I think it's important to understand that we do know without a shadow of a doubt, this is not controversy, that Marcion did change things about Christianity that affect us today and affect the way that we practice Christianity. So the thing I want to do in this video is to tell you 5 things that Christianity gets from Marcion. 5 things, 5 ways that Marcion forever impacted Christianity in the 2nd century that still impact us today. All the time today. Now, this is not really controversial stuff. Most of this, I think, I might get a little pushback on 1 or 2 of these points, but I lifted 4 of these points right from Jason BeDuhn's fantastic book. Most of these 5 points are pretty widely accepted. Point number 1, we probably have Marcion to thank for the idea that Christians should have a New Testament. Marcion is apparently, as far as we know, he's probably the first person to use the word New Testament. And some of his detractors and later, like the later decades after him, these people who wrote against him, people like Irenaeus and Tertullian, often wouldn't use the word New Testament because they associated with Marcion. And obviously, eventually the church became okay with it. But this is really important. It's Marcion who comes up with this idea that Christians should have their own authoritative collection of books that should be different, obviously, because he didn't believe in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, or in his case, the Septuagint, which would be like the Greek Old Testament. He didn't believe Christians should be reading that. He believed that Christians should have their own New Testament. Now, as far as we can tell, this is kind of a radical idea in the 2nd century. I mean, you can kind of imagine as we get further and further away from like the moment, the event, the life of Jesus, whatever, maybe there does become more of a natural turn towards like written texts. But nevertheless, we don't actually see anybody before Marcion talking about a New Testament or talking about the need to have a uniquely Christian Bible. We do have somebody not too far away. Justin Martyr was kind of writing like around the same time. Justin Martyr, another famous like early Christian thinker. And Justin Martyr does talk about how in some of the churches that the memoirs of the apostles, that these are called gospels, he says. So there was apparently gospels being read in churches of some sort. We don't know what these look like. I've done other videos about it. Some people argue that maybe this was Mark's gospel. We don't exactly know which gospels Justin is using or referring to. But in any case, we do have some sense that there was some of this Christian literature being used for like church liturgy, but we don't actually have a sense that there should be a closed body of unique Christian literature. This comes from Marcion. It's interesting that for Marcion, we have a guy named Papias. Papias is a famous, very early church historian, and we just have him quoted in Eusebius, but he famously says that he's not all that interested in writings. He does talk a little bit about Christian writings, but the thing he says he's much more interested in is this sort of living and surviving voice that presumably maybe he had some sort of access to in these very early moments of the Christian church, but he's not all that interested in books. So here you have Marcion coming up with the idea that Christians should have their own unique New Testament, a collection of books. We probably owe this one to Marcion. The second thing we all take for granted that we probably do get from Marcion as well is the idea that this collection, that this New Testament, should be compiled of gospel material and letters. Marcion had his own New Testament made up of one gospel that he just called the Evangelion, like the gospel, and he had 10 letters of Paul, and that was his New Testament. And this idea that there should be gospel and letters together, we can presume that Paul's letters are circulating, we can presume that there are probably gospel books of some sort circulating, but we don't have the idea yet that a New Testament should look like this combination of gospels and letters brought together. That's something that Marcion seems to come up with as far as we can tell, and it's something that really sticks. At some point after Marcion, and as a response to Marcion, we get this famous work called the Muratorian Canon, the Muratorian Fragment. And this is an attempt to list the biblical books that whoever wrote this fragment, and it's a response to Marcion, but whoever wrote this fragment wrote up this canon of scripture as the authorized biblical books. And the one thing the Muratorian Fragment shows is that it just adopted this idea of gospels and letters. There's some different, it's not quite identical to our current New Testament. It's not identical to Marcion's either. It's kind of in between, but it does kind of carry on this assumption that a New Testament or a canon of scripture should be made up of gospel material and letters. And that's something that we get from Marcion. Let's talk about number 3. I think this is the most powerful and mind-bending thing if you stop and see it. Marcion gave us a Paul who is prominent and even central to Christianity. Paul was certainly popular. His letters were certainly circulating at some point, but we don't get the sense that everyone treated Paul the same way. It's really interesting to stop and think about this, that the earliest Christian writings we have that aren't Paul, let's put Paul on the shelf for a minute. The earliest Christian writings we have, I just talked about Papias. Papias talks a little bit about gospels. Papias never mentions letters of Paul. How is this possible? If these are the earliest Christian scriptures we have, the church historian Papias doesn't mention them. We also have early Christian writings like the Didache or the Shepherd of Hermas or the Epistle of Barnabas. All of these are pretty universally believed to be common early Christian writings, and they don't mention letters of Paul either. Now, you might argue there's some reason they might not, but something like the Didache, you could expect maybe to see letters of Paul. We don't really see letters of Paul in some early Christian texts, and I think the reason is relatively straightforward, that Christianity probably had some geographic variation. So in some places, the letters of Paul were probably being read and celebrated. We can imagine maybe in some of these places where these letters are addressed to, and maybe, churches like Antioch or something. But there were probably places that the letters of Paul, and even Paul himself, weren't all that popular. We do see a Paul backlash in some early Christian literature, and we do have some evidence that in places like Jerusalem or other parts of Syria or in Egypt, Paul's letters may not have been as popular as other early Christian works. I've mentioned in some of my other videos this famous archaeological site of Oxyrhynchus, where we get tons of early Christian papyri from. This is in Egypt. The most popular books there are the Gospel of John, and second is the Shepherd of Hermas. Paul is not that common until the 3rd, 4th centuries. So this is really interesting. What do we make of it? We don't know, but it does seem very likely that it's Marcion that we have to thank for the universality of Paul. Because what does Marcion do by creating a New Testament that is made up of a gospel and Paul's letters? It centers on Paul's letters, in this case, 10 letters of Paul. But what would happen is that every New Testament going forward had a huge collection of Paul's letters. This is something that stayed with the New Testament, and maybe it was there before Marcion, we just don't know, but it certainly stayed with the New Testament after Marcion. In fact, it seems that Marcion transformed Paul from this important apostle to many communities to the apostle whose letters define Christianity, and this would carry through to orthodoxy as well. So here's a cool quote from Irenaeus of Lyon, who in his book Against Heresies spends a lot of time criticizing Marcion, but listen to what he says about Marcion. He says that Marcion is too focused on Paul. He says, with regard to those, he's talking about the Marcionites, who alleged that Paul alone knew the truth and that to him the mystery was manifested by the revelation, let Paul himself convict them when he says that one and the same God wrought in Peter for the apostolate of the circumcision and in himself for the Gentiles. Galatians 2 verse 8. Paul therefore was an apostle of that very God whose was also Paul, and him who Peter preached as God among those of the circumcision, and likewise the Son of God, and Paul did declare those among the Gentiles. Fascinating here, he's basically trying to say, like, Paul's not the only game in town. And it's really interesting because if you look around the time of Irenaeus, we get the first mention of, you have to look at Marcus Vincent's work for this, and you can look at the interview I did with him. Marcus Vincent argues that this is the point at which we get Acts. This is the point at which we get the pastorals and these other letters being brought into the collection. So we have a growing movement of a New Testament that obviously still remains like really Paul focused, but we have an explanation of why it's Paul focused. We have a story in the book of Acts of why this trajectory goes from Peter, James, John, all the way to Paul. And we have letters by those people, by Peter, James, John, that are added into the New Testament around this time or a little bit after. So you don't necessarily have to agree that Acts was created as a response to Marcion, or that indeed you don't have to agree with Marcus Vincent's argument, although I find it very convincing that the New Testament was largely rewritten as it was being compiled as a response to Marcion in the late 2nd century. I find that compelling, but you don't have to agree with that. But the thing I think we probably do have to reckon with is that it's likely Marcion that we have to thank for the popularity of Paul. And it's interesting, this is a side note, but there's a famous verse in 2 Peter 3 where the author slips and calls Paul's letters scripture. And sometimes people will say to me, well, that means that they think Peter wrote this. So they'll say, well, that means Peter knew that Paul was writing scripture. And I think, no, that means whoever is writing 2 Peter much later as a pseudepigrapha, and you can watch this video I did on why 2 Peter is forged, but you can see that 2 Peter is already taking for granted that Paul's letters should be viewed as scripture. So writing 2 Peter while assuming that Paul's letters are scripture is a really interesting thing to stop and realize, that this writer believed Paul's letters were scripture, not because he was writing in the 60s, but because he was writing in the 2nd century. Really fascinating. And again, it's hard to trace this back beyond Marcion. So number 4, there's a little bit of crossover here with my first point, but number 4 is that Marcion's push was the inception of the idea that Christians needed their own scripture with their own canon. So in point number 1, I talked about the idea that Christians should have their own New Testament. In this point, I want to take this a little bit further and argue that we do get from Marcion the idea that Christians needed their own canon. And, even if you accept the Orthodox story that came to us, so the Orthodox story that comes is that Marcion came up with all these books that he had rewritten, and the Orthodox put in, like we put in the canon, to protect from Marcion. Even if you accept that, and I don't think it's quite that simple, but even if you do accept that story, you still get a point where we have Marcion to thank for the idea that Christians needed a canon. And even when I did intro to church history courses, this is what I learned, that Marcion was a really pivotal flashpoint for the development of the canon. And it's hard to say. I mean, it seems likely that at some point we would have had something like a canon as the movement grew and as texts became more important. But nevertheless, it does seem that we owe this idea of a Christian canon to Marcion. Finally, number 5, and I think this is the most interesting, is that from Marcion, not directly, but from this whole thing with Marcion, we get this idea that Christian texts can be corrupted, can be edited, and this idea that you need to have the right texts and you need to have the right versions of texts to protect orthodoxy. This is something that I don't know that we'd have if we didn't have Marcion, and it's something that's continued down through history, not only with the development of the canon itself, which is important, but even with the idea that there could be things copied that could have things worked into them, and even textual criticism, which is a more modern discipline. But there was some of this kind of stuff happening around this time, because the famous accusation was that Marcion did more work with the knife than with the pen. So basically what Tertullian says when he accuses Marcion of this is he argues that Marcion chopped up letters. Why? Because Marcion has this thing called the Evangelion. It obviously looks something like the Gospel of Luke. And Tertullian thinks that what Marcion did is took the Gospel of Luke and chopped off things like the birth story and made his own gospel. So he says he was messing with this text, and that's why he did this, because he basically used a knife instead of a pen. Marcion, on the other hand, claimed that the text had been corrupted by Judaizers and that it was people adding things in that were more Jewish that needed to be taken out or adjusted. And again, we only get this secondhand, so take it with a grain of salt, because Marcion did leave a lot of stuff in his version of the scriptures that still was very Jewish, but that's a different conversation. The point I want to make here is that after Marcion, on both sides, on all sides, we get the understanding that texts can be corrupted. It's important to have the right text, and you start to get an obsession over which texts in the canon, obviously, but you also get this chain of authority, that you get these texts that go back to the apostles, and this emphasis, if you remember what Eusebius says when he's talking about canon, that there's an emphasis on texts that have apostolic authority. This is a really important thing, and this is critical to Christianity moving from being a living movement. And if you look at like the words of Papias, again, he wasn't really as interested in texts. You also see a lot of people before this, if they do quote texts, Justin Martyr's a great example, it's hard to even know what gospels he's quoting because he's kind of loose about it. He's not really that obsessed with it. But after Marcion, you get an obsession with having the right texts, quoting the right texts, protecting the right texts. And that is something that has stayed with Christianity. It's still something we engage with today. And also, and this is important too, the idea that you can have church authority and church structure to protect the transmission, to protect the chain of transmission for those texts. That is also an idea that is still very popular today. From Marcion on, we get the idea that heresies can be caused by having the wrong texts, and orthodoxy can be promoted by having the right texts. And this wasn't the case, for example, like with the famous quote-unquote Gnostic heresies, which I could do a video about. But in that case, they're all using the same text. But after Marcion, we have this obsession that heresy is about having the wrong texts, orthodoxy is about having the right texts. So how can we be sure we have the right texts? There's so much more that I could say about Marcion, and there's so much interesting work being done right now by historians of early Christianity around the work and the life and the legacy of Marcion. There's tons, and there's like too much to talk about in this video, but it's all fascinating to me and I'm following a lot of it. Do watch that interview with Marcus Vincent if you want to know a little bit more. I actually lifted, I have to confess, a good scholar, I have to cite my sources. I lifted most of the structure of this video right from Jason BeDuhn's fantastic book, Marcion in the New Testament. So I will leave a link to that book below. I will leave a link to a bunch of other great Marcion resources. If you are just hearing about Marcion, I hope this video helps you to understand a little bit more who he was, and most importantly, what his legacy was on Christianity. Every single Christian today lives in the shadow of Marcion, whether they know it or not. And regardless of where some of the exciting theories and biblical studies about Marcion go, these 5 things are pretty much, I think, indisputable. Feel free to dispute in the comments you want, but these 5 things are pretty much indisputable. These are 5 impacts that Marcion had on Christianity that have lasted until today. Hope that was interesting to you. Let me know what you think. As always, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, take a second, subscribe, hit that bell notification. That will let you know when I have new videos coming out. I do also have a podcast where I interview the top scholars in the world on the Bible and Christian origins. It's called Footnote Famous. You can find out more at footnotefamous.com or Footnote Famous on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to listen. I'll see you next time.